At dawn on the morning of the 6th of June, 1944, 225 Rangers jumped off the British landing craft and ran to the bottom of these cliffs. Their mission was one of the most difficult and daring of the invasion: to climb these sheer and desolate cliffs and take out the enemy guns. The Rangers looked up and saw the enemy soldiers at the edge of the cliffs shooting down at them with machine guns and throwing grenades. And the American Rangers began to climb. When one Ranger fell, another would take his place. When one rope was cut, a Ranger would grab another and begin his climb again. They climbed, shot back, and held their footing. Soon, one by one, the Rangers pulled themselves over the top, and in seizing the firm land at the top of these cliffs, they began to seize back the continent of Europe.
The teamwork and determination displayed on that fateful day at Pointe du Hoc not only demonstrates the best of the United States Army, but it also represents our mission at the Association of the United States Army. Soldiers supporting soldiers. For almost 75 years, AUSA has served soldiers, providing a voice for the Army, and celebrated those who have helped the Army community. We've experienced tremendous growth and are now over 1 million members strong and growing. We continue to provide essential services to soldiers, civilians, retirees, veterans, and family members. We engage with the Army, Congress, industry partners, and communities across the globe. And we work to advance national security and promote greater recognition of the Army's vital role in American life. But we're not stopping there. We're evolving the way we educate, inform, and connect America to the Army. We're developing our Center for Leadership to inspire Army leaders. We're investing in our Army communities with a broader membership reach. And we're building stronger links between generations to support the Army's critical needs. As we charted AUSA's path for the future, we realized we needed a new symbol to represent what we do. A logo inspired by the significance of the soldier experience and the Army story. A logo inspired by our focus on people. Because, as General Creighton Abrams said, people aren't in the Army. They are the Army. A logo inspired by the achievements of those brave soldiers at Pointe du Hoc on that fateful day in 1944. This is that emblem. AUSA. It takes a team. Soldiers, families, civilians, retirees, veterans, industry, and you.
The Association of the United States Army is pleased to welcome you to AUSA's New Report webinar series. This webinar series features presentations by senior Army leaders responsible for key programs and initiatives. It also features contemporary military authors who weave together the past, present, and future story of the United States Army. Kicking off today's webinar is the Director of AUSA's Education and Programs Department, Nzinga Curry. Good afternoon and welcome to the Association of the United States Army's Noon Report. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. We appreciate your support as partners in the defense of our nation. Joining us today is James Lechner, author of With My Shield, an Army Ranger in Somalia. Please take advantage of having Mr. Lechner here to ask questions. You can use the Q&A tab on the right side of your screen to submit a question. After the discussion, we will take as many questions as possible. You can find a full bio for Mr. Lechner and our moderator, the Honorable Patrick Murphy, in the Handout tab. As stated, the moderator for today's discussion is the Honorable Patrick Murphy, who is an AUSA Senior Fellow. He served as Undersecretary of the Army from 2015 to 2017. He joined the Army at 19 and served as a paratrooper with the 82nd Airborne Division during the invasion of Iraq and previously in Bosnia. Mr. Murphy is a graduate of King's College Army ROTC program and a graduate from the Widener University Commonwealth School of Law. As a criminal prosecutor, he prosecuted high-level terrorists, including one of the top lieutenants in the Supreme Court of Iraq, the Central Criminal Court of Iraq. He is a former professor at West Point, served as the first Iraq War veteran in Congress, and is an author of Taking the Hill, From Philly to Baghdad to the United States Congress, which was published in 2008. Weekly, Mr. Murphy is a guest on Fox Business and Fox News and is currently a visiting lecturer at the U.S. Army War College. Patrick, I turn the floor over to you.
Thanks, Ms. Carey. Appreciate it. It is a great day to be here with a great American. James Lechner is a 1989 graduate of the Citadel, a retired U.S. Army infantry officer who served for 27 years and participated in 8 operational deployments, including Somalia with Task Force Ranger, as well as Sinai, Bosnia, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Professor Lechner has also served at the national policy level, including advising the National Security Council at the White House and numerous tours at the Central Intelligence Agency. He holds his master's in history and teaches U.S. history as the adjunct professor at Liberty University. Currently, he is serving as a military advisor during the Russo-Ukrainian War, for which he has covered almost every major battle from the ground as a war correspondent with Newsmax. This is his great book, With My Shield, an Army Ranger in Somalia. Jim, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Honored to be here.
All right, so right from the jump, I have to start. You joined the Army with the basic training at age 17 between your junior and senior year. You're the son of a Marine, and it took you 10 years to get that scroll with the Ranger Battalion. Why did you join the military? Why did you become an American warrior?
I felt like it was my calling. I knew what I wanted to do from a very young age. Early on, I was also inspired by the Rangers and their legacy. And so, again, as you mentioned, that was my goal when I joined the Army, to be an infantryman, to eventually be an infantry officer, and then to serve in the Army Ranger Regiment. Yeah,
and you started in the National Guard first, and then went active duty. I always remind people we have 1 million soldiers in our Army, and the majority are actually in the reserve component, the National Guard and Reserve.
Right.
You wrote this book, and I quote, you said, "I hope this book is an ode to the brotherhood of men in battle." Why did you write this book?
There's a couple of main reasons. The first one is it's a story that I think needs to be remembered by the American people. I think it's grown to legendary status, but I'm always surprised in recent times, even though there's been a movie and other books written about it, that a lot of people don't know the story. And I think it's important to honor those guys, not necessarily to tell my story, but to honor Task Force Ranger. I think it's an inspiring story. I think it stands for a lot of important themes that are at debate and issue right now. Hard training, brutal and realistic training. Civilians often see military training. Good military training is brutal, but there's a reason for it. The brotherhood of men, as you talked about, unit cohesion, the things that develop in a unit to be able to withstand that kind of test of combat. And I think Task Force Ranger and its story is a testament to that, why those things are important, especially as we debate some of those in today's society.
Yeah. Before we go into Task Force Ranger, I love the quote that you're men of faith, and you talk, and I met your beautiful wife Beth earlier, but you talked about how you were divided between your wife's Southern Baptist and you were raised as Roman Catholic. But I love the fact that you quote it in your book, Psalm 28:7. The Lord is my shield and my strength.
At the personal level, that's always been the case for me. It's a matter of reaching down inside yourself and persevering no matter what the situation is, no matter how extreme it gets, like a battle in Somalia. But for me, I've always been dependent on the fact that the Lord has a plan for me, had a plan for me to go to the Ranger Battalion. We talk about that in the book. The circumstances of me being part of that mission were not ordinary, very extraordinary, things coming together in time and space that, as Winston Churchill says, are beyond time and space. And so to me, it's very obvious that it was part of the Lord's path for me, and that sustained me not only through that battle, but through my whole career, the other opportunities that I've had.
Yeah, you were a lieutenant at that point in
Yeah.
Task Force Ranger, October of 1993. I had just joined the Army myself the month before as an ROTC cadet at King's College. But let's paint the picture historically, if that's okay. So 1990, Saddam Hussein invades, obviously, Kuwait, Desert Storm, Desert Shield. August, 3 years later, August of 1993, these criminal militias, these terrorists, this militia in Somalia, killed 4 Americans in a Humvee. They're going after our men. Task Force Ranger obviously was called upon. Paint the picture of 3rd Battalion Ranger Regiment battalion at that time.
Yeah, as you mentioned, I joined the battalion literally the week the Desert Storm, Desert Shield was kicking off. Again, an extraordinary set of circumstances that brought me there, not just a normal recruiting aspect. Planets kind of coming into alignment. The battalion did not get to go, and that was really shattering disappointment for us to Desert Storm. But we continued to train like we were going to the Super Bowl. I mean, the intensity level of training in the Ranger Regiment, I know you're familiar with. And after about 3 years of that, I was getting ready to leave the battalion. And literally the last weeks that I was in the battalion before I would leave and go off to the advanced course, the mission for Somalia came together. And again, extraordinary circumstances brought me into the position. I was from A Company. B Company was selected at the very last second. I was brought to B Company for the mission. So got to deploy with B Company as part of Task Force Ranger from 3rd Ranger Battalion in literally the last weeks that I was in the battalion.
Yeah, and you walk the reader through it. It jumps from the pages. It's awesome. One of the heroes that you serve with, his daughter has actually joined us today, and remind folks they could ask questions. We're going to go to the Q&A out there. So if you have questions, please put it in the queue. But one of those heroes you served with was actually your bunkmate over there in Somalia, First Sergeant Glenn Harris. I was just with his daughter Tara at the National Veterans Museum Memorial in Columbus, Ohio, for Memorial Day. He died a year later in training in a parachute jump. And it's, as General Patton once said, you know, a gallon of sweat prevents losing an ounce of blood. Talk to us about some of that training, some of the things that stood out. Because you had a tough upbringing at the Citadel, you know, obviously Ranger School, then with the regiment.
Well, yeah, and I always sought out things like the Citadel, like going to basic training out of high school and things to prepare myself personally. But the Ranger Regiment really takes that seriously, knowing that the likelihood of them going to combat is extreme. And so we train and still train just like we're going to go into battle as closely as we can. And unfortunately, tragically, that means we're going to lose guys. During the period of Desert Storm, we lost more Rangers in training than most units lost in combat during Desert Storm and Desert Shield. So, and tragically, my good friend Glenn Harris, who was the first sergeant of B Company, one of the first guys to welcome me from A Company into B Company for the mission, and just set that example of leadership and building unit cohesion. Every Ranger in B Company would agree he's a key example of how to build unit cohesion. A strong leader, not just a good cop, but a guy that kept things going, but really an example. And tragically, we lost him in training about a year later. But that's how the Ranger Regiment is. It's going to spearhead missions and has to be ready to do it. Yeah.
I'm going to focus on Task Force Ranger in a second. Can I just start? Today's an historic day. Today is the 80th anniversary of D-Day. You're about to fly out to go over there in Normandy. And when you look historically, obviously, we went against Nazi Germany, the tyranny of evil. And we celebrate those heroes from World War II, those Rangers as well. And it set the tone for what happened that day. Why is it going over there, over to Normandy today, so important to you?
Well, I'm personally very honored to be here today, but as a Ranger, I'm especially honored with the backdrop of Pointe du Hoc. We're talking about that. Again, just an incredible story of what Rangers do in combat and give to this country. We not only spearheaded the invasion on the beach with 2nd and 5th Battalion, but 2nd Battalion, had a special operation that day to climb the cliffs and destroy the guns on top of Pointe du Hoc, and just an amazing, legendary act of valor by that unit. And when I arrived in the Ranger Regiment, it became very clear to me, they tell you that this is the standard to which you must perform. There's a likelihood you'll be in combat, and if you go, this is the standard. And so it's just an incredible legacy to have to live up to. And I hold them in the highest honor. And I'd like to think that Task Force Ranger just added another chain in the link of that legacy of valor.
Yeah, and you spent the last 2 years on and off in Ukraine. Talk about what's going on there.
Yeah, again, another just a once in a lifetime experience. Again, I'm obviously retired. I got to go over there initially as a Newsmax correspondent. Had some once in a lifetime opportunity to observe and actually advise and assist the Ukrainian military. And again, a very unique situation. And it was referred to today in some of the VIP speeches given at Normandy that this is something that Europe hasn't seen since World War II, a Marxist tyranny using military aggression to invade its neighbor, a democracy. And so for me, a once in a lifetime experience to be there in Ukraine, to help the Ukrainians defend against this. And it just, the perspective and the identification I have now with the World War II generation, being outnumbered against a tyranny, fighting under those conditions, for that cause, has just, for me, been a once in a lifetime experience. And I really would encourage Americans to take this spirit of D-Day and why we sacrificed on those beaches, and remember that's what they're doing in Ukraine right now.
Yeah. And I appreciate the fact that you teach now at Liberty University and elsewhere. So let's paint the picture of Sunday, October 3rd, 1993. Not a really an unusual day. I mean, you started in the morning, you were swimming with some buddies, you're in training, it took a couple hours off. And one of the other soldiers in the 10th Pound Division was killed by a shark.
That's right.
And paint the picture, if you wouldn't mind, of that day. I know, because it jumps out at the pages.
Yeah, as you said, it was a relative down day, and in a special operations task force, any special operator out there can identify with this. You're really on a string. You're ready to go. Your gear is stacked. The aircraft or your vehicles are ready to go, and we were on a moment's notice. I mean, just minutes notification to spin up and launch. But it was a relative down day. We've been doing some swimming. We got some intelligence that there was a possible hit. As that intelligence built, we started to increase our readiness and saddle up and get into the aircraft. We did this a number of times every day in response to intelligence. So we weren't overly concerned or overly excited until engines started turning. The commander of the task force came out and started shaking people's hands, and then we lifted off. And when we did, one of the memories I have is the Rangers cheering, because we knew we were going into an objective that we were very confident we could take down. We did take it down, but we knew there was going to be a fight, and that's part of our legacy.
Yeah. 18-hour firefight. You lose 19 men. You were injured as well. But tell us about some of those moments that stood out to you, if you don't mind.
Yeah, just again, an incredible experience. But anybody that's familiar with special operations knows that they're very well planned, very critically timed and executed. And that's exactly how our raid was. It was an hour time frame. It was going like clockwork. But then combat intervenes. The enemy gets a vote in those well-laid plans. And one of our helicopters was shot down by what we have found out was an Al-Qaeda trained gunner that took one of our helicopters down. And from that point on, it shifted from being a well-oiled, well-executed special operations raid to a fight in the streets. Yeah. And one of the biggest firefights since Vietnam is as less than 125 guys on the ground had to fight to secure that crash site against tens of thousands of Somalis as we'd struck right in their stronghold in the middle of the day. And again, because we had to get the guys out of the helicopters, there was 2 bodies pinned in the wreckage. We had to execute that. We had to literally go back to our small unit training, our unit cohesion, the fact that we were going to stand together like a shield wall. We were not going to take a step back no matter what came at us, and that's the only way we could survive and wait to be linked up with by the rest of the UN.
Yeah, I know for me, it was going on in real time as a young, 19-year-old just joining the Army for wearing a cloth, and I had, my cadre was a Captain O'Donnell, who's still as a civilian now at Fort Knox, Kentucky, still at Cadet Command. But just learning about it and learning those lessons, you have a great quote that I would like to read. Just as training is important, leadership is possibly the single most important factor in an effective combat unit. That leadership, that ethos, leave no one behind. You saved the life of someone like Mike Durant. You served in a company of heroes. What does that mean for you during that time as a young lieutenant, and how has that guided you the rest of your life?
Well, yes, and it refers to the title "With My Shield" because the Spartan adage is "Come back with your shield or on it," and I feel like the task force, not just me personally, but the task force lived up to that standard today. That you talk about leadership. If we look at what happened on Normandy, the American soldier ran into just an incredible situation there, but leadership from General Cota and and Colonel Rudder, et cetera. Leadership is what carried the day at Normandy. That was doubly, events that day with Task Force Ranger. Leaders on the ground is what kept things together. In the Rangers, it was small unit leadership. The fire team leaders, the squad leaders, the platoon sergeants, they kept their guys together. They fought for their corner of the street. And again, it just highlights the training. It's not just the individual spirit, but it's the training, the fact that you can rely on your brother to your left and your right, that he's going to fight as hard as you're fighting, and for you to let him down is unforgivable. And that's part of the Ranger legacy, and that's why we succeeded at Normandy, and that's why we succeeded on October 3rd.
Yeah, and this is obviously, with Delta Force, with the Rangers, you walk through in a book about the four corners of what you're doing and the certain areas. What were some of the, I read it, but for the folks that didn't get a chance to read it yet, walk them through some of the mishaps, some of the things that happened that you learned from, that you had to adapt and overcome.
Yeah, sure. This is the days before the war on terrorism. We had put the team together, we had trained together, but there was still a lot of bumps in the road trying to get the various units to work together. The special operators, the Tier 1 special operators, the Ranger Company, the aviation elements that belonged to us from the 160th. There was some bumps in the road trying to tie that together, especially with the intelligence collection piece. That was very ad hoc. People did their best, but it was ad hoc. One of the great things about that, though, was Joint Special Operations Command took the lessons learned, the problems that we had, the great successes, but then the problems that we had in Mogadishu, and they sharpened the blade. They made the Special Operations Command better, and by the time the war on terrorism kicked off, we'd addressed many of those things with one of the most efficient manhunting machines that's ever gone into combat. So I think that's also an important legacy of Task Force Ranger.
Yeah, and we're at the 30-year anniversary of when that happened,
right.
And so the lessons learned, because after that, obviously, who knew right. Roughly 8 years later, 9/11 would happen,
exactly,
right?
Yeah.
And what are some of the lessons from that day do you think is applicable, not just in Iraq and Afghanistan, the longest wars in American history, but to our warfighters, especially warfighters at tip of the spear?
Yeah, well, I think training as you're going to fight, that's one of the most important things. We made some minor changes and minor tweaks into what we normally did when we executed for the operation, and those things really came back to bite us. We used different kind of radios. We used some different techniques for fire support, which was my job that day. And while they worked okay outside of heavy combat, once we're in heavy combat, some of those things came back to bite us. Leadership, being on the ground, that's a lesson we were taught. We were taught individually from Vietnam and learned those lessons, and we should have probably carried that a little bit better in Task Force Rangers. So the leader being on the ground, a unified chain of command, and making sure everybody knows what the mission is and everybody is working together on the same sheet of music. And again, all the successes we had, those are some of the things that we kind of ran into that were a problem. I mentioned the intelligence aspect, having a very integrated intelligence collection system. We'd had a Navy anti-submarine hunter working for us. That was non-standard. Again, they tried their best, but it just wasn't something that really was a good fit. Today, we worked those kind of things out, and we saw that manifest itself in the war on terrorism. But I really think when it comes down to success in combat, such as we're talking about there, heavy combat, it comes down to hard training, often brutal, realistic training, and then developing unit cohesion through brotherhood and shared experience and leadership.
Yeah. We talked about Glenn Harris earlier, First Sergeant. Mike Durant, I had a chance to be with him at the Super Bowl this year in Las Vegas, him and his wife. His son's at University of Notre Dame, right now, went to a sister school, King's College. Are you still in touch with some of the folks? I mean, this was an 18-hour firefight. And you took out the odds of 10 v1. I mean,
Sure.
It was outnumbered by 10. Do you still talk to the men that you got, the company heroes that you served with that day?
Oh, sure. It's one of the greatest experiences of my life that I get to stay in touch with these guys. We're together on social media quite a bit daily, I'd say. We just had the 30th anniversary reunion this past October. And it's always great to see those guys. And while you may not be in touch with them daily, or you may not see them, or you may not consider them like one of your best friends, the bond with anybody that was on the ground that day, it's just a unique perspective that you can't explain to anybody else. And I talk about this a little bit in the book, but when I get together with any of those guys, I always learn something. And then there's just this special bond because only they know what you went through that day. They can share that experience with you. And I've experienced that many other times in the 6 different wars I've been in, but this is obviously my first experience and a very unique experience because it's just a small number of guys. And it really goes back to that Shakespeare quote of "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers." So it's really one of the great aspects of my life that I was a member of Task Force Ranger.
Yeah, you walk people through in a book about even the Night Stalkers, the 160th, and
100%.
how in Vietnam you would put your helmet, you'd sit on your helmet so in case you would get
Right.
shot up, but they laid down the Kevlar on the floor. What was that like? Serving with heroes like Mike Durant and others.
Yeah, that's really when I talk about the task force, I absolutely mean the guys in the air above us because when you talk about a shield wall with guys to your left and your right, this was 3-dimensional. We had guys in the air above us, and I've worked with lots of air power before, and just usually by the way it's set up, they're coming from point A to point B and then go home, and you don't know who the pilot is. Not the case in Task Force Ranger. They were with us. They were integrated into the task force. They slept, lived right there with us. I flew in the same helicopter every day with Mike Durant and Ray Frank, sat in the same place. So really a close bond with them. And when it came down to combat, I've been in a lot of different situations where you're not necessarily getting the air power when things get rough on the ground. This was the opposite of that. The aviators and Task Force Ranger, I just can't say enough about them. The way they exposed themselves recklessly, exposed their own lives to make sure we were safe on the ground. I talk about this in the book extensively. They came through in the first gun runs without firing to make sure they could see us and keep us safe. And they absorbed all the firepower the Somalis could throw at them just to do that. And then when they finally did come in, I believe it was one of the decisive aspects, the amount of firepower they brought to give us the breathing space we needed to survive on the ground.
Yeah. You talk, and I know you don't like to talk about yourself, but you were injured with a lot of others. And you eventually went over, obviously, Walter Reed. Can you talk to us about what went through with your leg and the injuries that you sustained and some of the heroes you served with?
Sure. As an infantryman, I always, I like to focus on the combat aspects of things, but I really think some of the most unsung or heroic people in the military are the medical profession. They really are even better than what we build them up to be. Just my experience with that, starting out at the evacuation hospital in Mogadishu through Landstuhl, but especially at Walter Reed. I can't say enough about them. The most professional, the most advanced trauma, combat trauma treatment you can possibly receive. So while I am not a huge supporter of most federal government system things, I can tell you that the Army medical system is absolutely the pinnacle of caring for soldiers. 13 surgeries to rebuild my leg. I was shot, took an AK-47 round at about 10 feet. Had a hole the size of a grapefruit in my leg, 13 surgeries to rebuild that. Their incredible skill enabled me to go back to the infantry and to go back to the Ranger Regiment, and I parachuted and ran a marathon on it. So again, I can't say enough about the Army medical system with its pinnacle at Walter Reed.
Yeah. You also talked about folks that frankly visited you, the President of the United States, members of Congress, but also Arnold Schwarzenegger. Tell us how that went about.
Yeah, that was really neat. It was a big week, as you mentioned. The President and the Secretary of Defense had come the previous weekend. Apparently, Arnold Schwarzenegger was filming a movie here in D.C. at the time. Got a day off, and to his credit, immediately started visiting guys. Came to visit me and my wife at the hospital in Walter Reed. Signed some pictures. It was a lot of fun to talk to him and talk about Conan the Barbarian, one of my favorite movies. And things like that. So, yeah. That's
awesome. All right. Well, listen, I know we have to go out here and answer some questions from the audience because I could sit here all day and chat with you. So how about we go to the tower? Did you have any experiences, good or bad, that impacted you in a big way and the person on the other end has no idea the impact they made?
Sure. There was, different members of the task force that were doing their job. And again, I was a young lieutenant. I'd been in the battalion for 3 years. So from that perspective, I was relatively experienced. But just watching some of the other professionals do their job and just making it look easy. Again, some of the pilots, Cliff Walcott, who was killed in Super 6-1, I was in very close contact with him. He was one of the leads that day, and just the way he executed his job and carried himself was very inspirational. As I mentioned, First Sergeant Harris was certainly an inspiration on how to be a tough leader. Not necessarily a candy man or handing out sunshine all the time, but still somebody that everybody loved and respected, especially under a very difficult circumstances. Any kind of task force, things are going to be chaotic and change constantly. That mission, even from the strategic level, was turned on and turned off 3 or 4 times before we even deployed. So again, he always kept things positive and professional. Just a number of examples like that. General Boykin, who was our task force commander, had been a veteran of numerous combat to include Grenada, and then General Garrison, who was the overall commander, was a Vietnam veteran. And for them to bring their previous combat experience to us and keep our spirits up and tell us this is just how it is, and we're very straight with us, and great leadership just was very inspiring that day.
Yeah, about 80% of folks who serve in the military come from military families. I mentioned in the beginning, your dad was a Marine. You mentioned Vietnam a couple times. Obviously, I'm named after a Vietnam veteran who gave the ultimate sacrifice. His name was Specialist Patrick Ward. My father served during Vietnam. My 2 uncles served in Vietnam. The lessons learned from there, the lessons learned from obviously the Battle of Mogadishu, what do you think that applies to today when you say, hey, how's society treating our warriors after the longest wars in American history?
Well, that's a great question, and I think I'm involved in a number of veterans groups and charities that try to support veterans, and there's a number of different things that I think are important themes. I don't think we should be seen as victims. I hope I'm never seen as a victim. I volunteered time and again to get where I was to be in Task Force Ranger, and in spite of the fact that I was wounded, I'm not a victim. I was very honored to be there. I think every member of Task Force Ranger would tell you they were incredibly honored to be there, and their greatest fear was they were going to be cut for some reason at the last minute from the task force. And so I think it's important that veterans not see themselves as victims. I think it's important that society doesn't treat them as broken because they've been in combat. I think we should go back to the old school view that you really should be honored to be in combat, honored to serve your country, to have the opportunity to do that. Everyone should have an opportunity to serve their country in some way. It doesn't have to be the military. But if you were given that role to serve in the military and you served your country in combat, you should be honored by that sacrifice. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't support veterans. We certainly should. We should be, especially our catastrophically wounded veterans, the veterans that are not just that were killed in action and their families left behind, but veterans that are paralyzed and have some other terrible injuries. We talked about Walter Reed. Well, the two-edged part of that sword is that a lot of people are kept alive that would never have survived in previous combat, but often in very difficult conditions, paraplegics, quadriplegics, traumatic brain injury. And we should remember those guys. And really, I think personally, that's who we should focus on. And as for the rest of us in the military, we should just been honored that we served and given the opportunity to sacrifice for our country.
Yeah, I mean, some of the greatest Americans I ever met in my life were in combat with the 82nd in my case. And I always say our veterans are civic assets to this nation. I think that Bob Brown, General Bob Brown, a leader of AUSA, again, he's leading an organization of 1.6 million people. We have 9 regions, 122 chapters. But what he does, he pushes out information like, hey, we're civic assets. Veterans are more likely to vote in elections. Yeah. They're more likely to have jobs, to be employed. They're more likely to start a small business, for that small business to be successful. And, I worked out this morning. I was doing a little CrossFit workout in my Nikes. Nike was started by Phil Knight, an Army veteran. Yeah. The largest retailer in the world is Walmart, started by an Army veteran. Largest, one of the largest restaurants was Wendy's Restaurants. Dave Thomas, Army veteran. Again, who was at Fort Benning, now Fort Moore. But, to me, it's like we got to tell the stories of the brothers and sisters that served before us and how they were civic assets. And really, as brother and sister veterans, that you're asked by our country to still be a soldier for life, to still be a leader or character for a lifetime of service. All right, next question. Question, Somalia. Is there anything you felt strongly about as the years passed that changed your perspective about that battle or about our engagement in that region?
Yeah, that's a great question. If I could, I'll extrapolate that also to Iraq. But one of the things that I learned with Sean McFarlane when I was there in Iraq and a number of tours was how to do counterinsurgency. And to a degree, we were taught that by H.R. McMaster's also. And it's not just about firepower, and it's not just about fighting. And you got to realize that you can't kill your way out of a situation. We never could have killed our way out of Somalia. And what a lot of people don't know, and I talk about in the book, is 4 out of 5 of the major regions of the city of Mogadishu were pro-UN. They would wave at us as we went by. It was 1 out of 5. And so you got to lever that. You can't look at people monolithically. You got to take people as humans, one-on-one, and lever those things. You cannot kill your way out of any situation. And that really lent itself to our counterinsurgency efforts in Iraq. No matter how you feel about a culture, you got to take people on individually and as humans, and then you should also lever that for mission success. And it's not all about fighting. And I think Somalia is a great example. Somalia now today has a government. Most people don't know, but we're deeply involved in supporting that government over there. I've got veterans from Task Force Ranger who are actually still serving there today in a similar role, which it really kind of blows my mind. But again, Somalia shouldn't be looked at monolithically as a bunch of gunman terrorists. That certainly was the case that day and with that tribe, but across the board, we should look at them as a people, and they've evolved quite a bit, and they're actually cooperating with us today. So I think that applies, across the world generally.
Yeah, and think about, and you walk through it in the book, about 2 million people in that city, and we had to deal. And I get frustrated. We're here in Washington D.C. right now. I get frustrated because the easy button for politicians in Washington, whether Democrats, Republicans, or to send the military, right? And a lot of times it's like, hey man, we need a political solution. Right. We have the best military in the world, but sometimes you just need what's the end game, and how are they going to rise up themselves and carry on. So, all right, next question here. Hollywood often struggles to make accurate combat movies. In your opinion, how accurate was Black Hawk Down to actual events? And before you answer that, the author of the book Black Hawk Down is Mark Bowden, who's a friend of mine from Philadelphia, a great writer. He calls this book, and again, a must read if you're out there, a powerful and vivid account from a soldier's soldier. But how accurate was the movie, not necessarily the book?
You're right. Mark's a great friend and great author. I think the movie is about as accurate as it could be. A lot of people don't know those were actual Task Force 160 pilots and Army Rangers that were extras in the movie and flying the helicopters. So that's a pretty good degree of realism. But what you can't capture on the ground is the intensity of combat. You can't understand the story until it's your own story, until you can feel those bullets cracking and feel the things that are going on around you, and it's palpable. And so it's very difficult for Hollywood to get that accurate. Now, having said that, today I think Hollywood's doing a really almost too good a job. It's difficult for me to watch shows like Band of Brothers and things like that because they get too accurate. But I think what they try to show there is the intensity, the things that you experience from a traumatic perspective. But again, what I take from it, from things like Band of Brothers or Black Hawk Down, is that the importance of men standing together and trusting each other, and they're going to persevere by not letting each other down.
Yeah. And I think it's incumbent on all of us. I appreciate you writing this book and teaching the next generation at Liberty University, because, Tom Brokaw wrote the book, The Greatest Generation, but it was almost 50 years after World War II. And that's when they were defined. And they're frankly defined as the greatest generation, not just in what they did in Europe and the Pacific, but also they came back and they built America. And they started Walmart and Comcast and Nike and all these great companies. But I do think we have to do a better job. We don't tell our Army story well enough. So the fact that you're put yourself into the breach there and wrote this, I think is incredibly important. And for not just the viewers out there today, but for all of that's why I shared it on my social media. I tagged you in your social media, and I encourage others to get it out there and follow us on at AUSA.org or at Patrick Murphy PA or at Jim's book. All right. Question from Tara. Before, during, and or after the battle, was there anyone higher ranked than you that felt consistent in keeping the guys focused, positive, mentally and physically tough, specifically after the battle was over?
General Garrison was a big, obviously a key leader. He was the commander of the entire task force. And again, we knew he'd been in Vietnam. We knew he'd been in special operations, and he took the time. I remember one time he actually just took all the lieutenants. He just wanted the lieutenants from B Company, and he wanted to kind of mentor them off to the side. But he would do that frequently. When I mentioned we were getting ready to take off on this mission, it was General Garrison who came out and kind of shook everybody's hand as we got on the helicopters. So he was a key leader. As I mentioned, General Boykin certainly. And so those were some of the guys that were our senior leaders that day and did a good job at trying to keep us informed of what was going on, tell us not just what we were going to do, but why we were going to do it, why it was important. And as a lieutenant, I was later to find out that's not always the case. A lot of times you're just told to go and do. They took the effort to inform us why it was important and what was going on above us, because we had a lot of questions. And so that sticks out in my mind as a leadership example.
Yeah. You mentioned Lieutenant General Sean McFarland earlier. He's a senior fellow with us.
Sure.
I was just with him yesterday, and he wrote, if it's okay,
Sure.
if I share this, he says he hopes your next book is going to be about the awakening in Ramadi. Can you share why that's the case?
Well, sure. I again, as mentioned, I've been in Ukraine's my 6th war. I've been in 6 different wars now. The next one in intensity to Somalia was Ramadi. General McFarland at the time, my brigade commander, I was the deputy brigade commander, and we were sent down there. We knew that was going to be a huge battle. At that time in Iraq in 06, about 35% of the overall casualties were accounted for just in the city of Ramadi. So we knew it was going to be a big fight. And I was very gratified that I'd had the experience of Somalia going into that kind of prepared me. And I hope in some way I was able to prepare a lot of our soldiers going into that. And so the resiliency that you need, the unit cohesion that you need going into a fight like that. I knew what we were going to experience to a degree. A lot of the guys around me did not know as far as the casualties we were going to take on a daily basis, who was going to be missing the next day. That was almost a daily experience for us in Ramadi. And so it was important, I think, for me to have that experience before I went in there. And again, General McFarland's another example of those leaders that empower their subordinates, back their subordinates up, and can think outside the box on what needs to be done, not just take a lockstep approach. And that's how we were able to succeed in Ramadi and fight a counterinsurgency plan. Not just taking the square pegs that we were given from Baghdad and hammer them into round holes. We found other ways to do it and other ways to succeed.
Yeah, to me, it goes down to loyalty. Right? I love the General Patton quote. He says, people talk about loyalty from the bottom up, but more rare is the officer that shows loyalty from the top down. And that loyalty to take the time to give you the why it's important. So you have that perspective. I think it's critical. You mentioned your wife, Beth. I do want to mention something that you wrote in your book. The support of a family, especially a wife, cannot be underestimated for a soldier at war. Their burden is greater under the weight of the unknown and fear of the unexpected knock at the door. You've been in 6 combat zones, 6 wars. What have you seen from the families, good, bad, or indifferent, that helps our men and women come home?
Yeah, there's a couple things I feel strongly about on that. And it obviously doesn't minimize the burden of what soldiers experience in combat, but I think it's an interesting perspective that the families are home and they're not being communicated with. They don't necessarily know what's going on, especially in this day of immediate or instant media. And so they're getting things from the media, but they don't exactly know what's going on. Beth experienced that to a degree in Somalia. It's even more to the fact today, almost instant coverage from the combat zone. And so it's an interesting perspective that they're dealing with that fear and that unknown, but yet experiencing it in a way as well. I also think it's important that we keep in mind the sacrifice that they've made and the children whose fathers are overseas, and then especially when it comes down to tragically Gold Star families. Again, that's who I think is really heroic. It is absolutely heroic that soldiers give everything for their country and sacrifice, but we should remember that Gold Star families are left behind, and they have to deal with that the rest of their life. And as I mentioned it in the book, that actually echoes for generations.
Yeah. And I think that's why it's important to keep telling their story. It's like, they're obviously, they give the ultimate sacrifice, but you never want their name to die. And that's why you have to repeat their name. You have to repeat and tell their stories. It's just powerful. All right, then we go to Matthew W., who asked this question. The media often portrays October 3rd as a military defeat disaster. What can be said or done to change that perception?
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, I teach history at Liberty, and history is all about context. And so just to take the stark facts that 18 guys were killed, a high number of casualties, that does not translate to defeat. From a tactical perspective, we achieved exactly what we wanted to achieve that day, and we succeeded in our mission. We captured all the targets that we were after, and we successfully got out. We paid an incredibly high cost, and as I mentioned, there was some things that were done very well, and there's some things that were not done very well. There's some mistakes that came out. But again, I think it also sets a couple things. The legacy I think we lived up to the legacy at Pointe du Hoc in Normandy that the Ranger Regiment has carried on throughout its history. I think, and that is not just bragging rights, but that proves what we've done for decades in the Ranger Regiment. It proves our system, which goes back thousands of years through the Spartans. That type of system is what you need in combat. And a lot of that's debated today. And I think people should look at examples such as Normandy and Task Force Ranger. When things don't really go well and they're very difficult, there is a reason that we do training the way we do it, and we select the people and the men for these units that we select. And so I would point to that success. We achieved our tactical objective and the performance of the unit in combat. I mean, the incredible odds, literally tens of thousands of enemy in a very difficult situation against less than 125 guys on the ground and some in the air, and what the performance of that task force was, again, similar to Normandy.
Yeah. In the book, you talk about when you're first there, there's other units, obviously Pakistanis, Italians, other countries in this UN force. You got intel that actually some of the foreign military, I'll call them out, the Italians, if that's okay.
Sure.
May have been given some information about your movements and your missions. Tell the readers and tell the viewers out there what happened, what your commanding general or commander did to nip that in the bud.
Yeah, interesting situation. Somalia was a former Italian colony. They had, and anybody that's been in intelligence knows it's a very tangled web. And the Italians had some connections still with the Somalis that we were opposed to, the Somali National Alliance, and there was some intelligence going through. So our command took a very hard stand on that, and we're not going to be diplomatic. We basically went down and surrounded their TOC with gun jeeps and showed them the intelligence that we knew what they were doing and it was going to end that day. So again, just very strong leadership, getting things done that have to be done. But I also want to say, I've served with the Italians later on, and they're good guys and they make good food. But I really appreciate it in the future. That kind of set me up too for coalition warfare in the future, and the fact that you've got to really you've got to make some sacrifices to bond in with your coalition partners, and there's got to be that mutual trust.
Yeah, I think one of the greatest strengths of our country is obviously our Constitution. We all take an oath to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. But it's also our partnerships. You look at the largest increase in population is actually in Africa. So Somalia, my brother's Air Force, 2 deployments. I did 2 deployments, but he was in Djibouti. But our alliances throughout the world, you spent the last 2 years on and off Ukraine. Why are those alliances so important, and how do we continue to maintain them, especially when you have the spread of aggression in countries like, with the Russians and
that's
others?
That's a great question. And as a history professor and a professional soldier, I can't stress the need and the importance of that enough. Our enemies at the strategic level, they watch what we do. Al-Qaeda watched what our response to Somalia was. I guarantee China, we know for a fact, China is watching our response in both Afghanistan and now in Ukraine. And we could talk about this a lot, but if you don't understand that Ukraine is a strategic conflict for NATO, then you don't really understand strategy, because China is watching that. It's not necessarily about what Russia's doing. It's in the world context what our response has been, and the lack of effectiveness and NATO's ability to stop this type of aggression that we haven't seen in 80 years.
Yeah. Last piece of advice to the young Army leaders out there, or older Army leaders out there, or even folks that are civilians. I mean, 60% of our membership in AUSA is actually civilian and not veterans. Sure. What piece of advice would you give them to be a better American?
Yeah, if I could just drill down on one thing, and the book is filled with with observations and advice and lessons learned, not from me, but from all kinds of people. We talked about, we were really trained in person by the Vietnam generation, and we learned all kinds of things and validated all kinds of things. But if there's one theme that I really would like to emphasize in that regard from the book, it's, we've been doing these military systems, this military culture and our traditions and our training methodology for thousands of years, going back to the Spartans and other professional armies, the origins of our professional armies. And there's a reason for it, because it works. And it's not just on a sunny day when it's not raining and you're using blanks. It's when combat becomes extremely adverse, like Normandy, like Mogadishu. It's going to happen again. We're going to be challenged, and our soldiers are going to be faced with adversity. I never thought I'd be without air power. I never thought I'd be outnumbered. I never thought I wouldn't have the overwhelming advantage that U.S. military normally has. I've found myself in that situation a number of times now. Mogadishu was the first, and that's going to happen again. And we should remember our old traditions are what civilians often see as brutal training. There's a reason for it, and our selection and the brotherhood that we have to build between men. And combat effectiveness and capability in combat is really what it comes down to. Not some sort of ornament or some sort of social progressive goal that we might have. It's combat effectiveness.
Yeah. Well, listen, it's a must-read book for the folks out there. With My Shield, an Army Ranger in Somalia, especially because it's the 30-year anniversary and just a vivid account. Please make sure you go on Amazon. Make sure you go to the bookstore and check it out. Jim, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.
You're a great American.
Very honored. Thank you.
Gentlemen, thank you for such a wonderful discussion, very inspirational. But before we part, I want to inform our viewers of a few upcoming events. AUSA will host a hot topic on cyber and information advantage on July 2nd at AUSA's headquarters. On 16 July, AUSA will host another noon report featuring William Nance, author of Commanding Professionalism, Simpson, Moore, and the 9th U.S. Army. AUSA will host a coffee series on 23 July featuring Lieutenant General Sean Gainey, Commanding General of the United States Army Space and Missile Defense Command. And on 30 July, we will host a new report with Dr. Lester Martinez Lopez, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Health Affairs. I hope you can join us for an upcoming webinar or event. For more information about any of these events or to register, please visit our website at ausa.org. Finally, we thank all of you who support us with your membership. Membership matters. You help us support the Army, and we thank you for attending this wonderful event. Have a great Army Day.